I'd like to introduce Rose Hennessy Garza, who is a faculty member at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And Dr. Garza is a prevention scholar, implementation scientist, and program evaluator focused on sexual violence prevention, women's health, and health disparities, with over a decade of experience in sexual violence prevention, advocacy, evaluation, and research. Her work primarily focuses in Wisconsin, but she also has national and global health projects that she has participated in. And she uses mixed methods, participatory action research, and culturally responsive evaluation to develop, implement, and study solutions to public health problems to help us move towards a world free from violence or threats of violence. Dr. Garza received her BA in Biology, Society, and Environment from University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and an MPH in Community Health Sciences from University of California, Los Angeles. She got her doctorate in public health from UW-Milwaukee. And postdoctoral training she did here with Dr. Andrew Quanbeck in the Implementation Science and Engineering Lab. And we got involved, Andrew Quanbeck, and Rose, looking at connections between translational science and implementation science. This is a journal results that have just been submitted for publication. A very interesting work. So thank you all for joining, and Rose, look forward to hearing this presentation. And please feel free during the presentation to put any questions in chat, and we'll come back at the end to elevate those so that we can have more of a discussion. So thank you, Rose.
Well, and I'll let you all monitor chat as well. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I'm just going to jump right in. I do need to start the presentation by really acknowledging and thanking our senior author, Dr. Andrew Quanbeck, UW-Madison. He's the senior author of this research. So this was his idea. I joke that I was like the one who, pushed the numbers and did it, but I really got to be involved in this paper. It is under review after a revise and resubmit. We're fortunate to have Dr. Mahoney as a co-author as well, and it's always wonderful to have students involved. So we've got a student who helped out. If you see a pretty figure, she gets all the credit, and with some references as well. So that being said, I want to jump right in and talk about some of the aims of what we're going to share today. So one, we're going to determine some key interconnected literature in the fields of translational science and implementation science. We'll talk about how we operationalize the term interconnected. We're going to discuss bridging publications between fields and how we thought about quantifying overlap. And then we'll discuss some applications of findings for practice and research. Before we do that, it is really important to take a step and talk about what is the difference between these two fields. As someone who is new-ish still to the field of implementation science within the last 5 years or so, I would use implementation, dissemination, translation without much thought as to, how they are different. But to clarify, NCATS defines translation as turning observations into interventions. So it's like we have research. How do we take this research and make it something that people can use? It's an intervention, it's a medication, it's a new device, as compared to implementation, which is really focused on adapting and integrating evidence-based health interventions into the community. So translation is let's create it, implementation is let's get it out there. And I know that, there are different definitions, and translation encompasses implementation as well. When we talk about the science of these two fields and what the goals and aims are for translation, The aim of translational science as a field is to identify guiding principles to improve the translation process. So how do we translate, more effectively and efficiently? Comparatively, for implementation, this is about how. We want to understand how these interventions become normalized and used in everyday settings. And, very importantly, across all sorts of populations, not just those that are in the right place at the right time or have the most privilege. So together, translational and implementation sciences aim to bridge the gap between what works to address health and what is done to address health. Most of you have probably heard our 17-year statistic, but I like this one better, that an estimated 85% of health research is wasted and does not translate into clinical practice. And that's just clinical practice. So that's not even wide-scale dissemination. And I think we'd like to see global dissemination of best practices and healthcare and in public health. So why does this topic matter? It seems kind of academic. We theorize that if these fields are more connected and scholars are working in greater collaboration, we can do things a little bit more efficiently and learn from each other as fields. Those who've worked in the area a long time will know that translational research, the term has been around a lot longer. Obviously, people have always been interested in implementation, but translational research, translational science, the terminology has been here longer. And when we look at a timeline, the very prominent Journal of Implementation Science, that didn't even start until 2006. So we have sort of a newer-ish field in terms of this terminology. And we also recognize that across countries, different terms are used. Here we're using the term implementation science. A recent publication coming out has built upon existing frameworks to show this one about how dissemination, implementation, and translation are connected. And what I want to point out about this, and I think is very important, is that they are interconnected and always have been fields, but also still separate. So on the right side of this chart, we see basic research and preclinical research. And in the upside down, very hard to read area, we talk about how we could integrate principles of D&I into these areas for improvement. But we're not pretending that we can take, cells from a lab and immediately integrate it into public health. When we start getting into clinical research, that's when we actually see interventions in D&I sciences. So what? We're curious. In general, are scholars citing each other? Scholars who identify in translational science, are they citing those in translational or in implementation science? And, there's lots of ways to look at that. We're going to use bibliographic metrics or the scientific literature to quantify that. And just practically, what can we learn from each other and how we can move forward? So that's sort of why we went forward with this study. So the methods of the study, we did a systematic search. Believe it or not, this is actually the part that took the longest with lots of conversations and working with research librarians. We searched in only Web of Science. We know that's a limitation, but it had to do with the software program that we were using. And there are some things we've done around that. In articles, review articles, books, and books chapters, within titles, keywords, keywords plus. Web of Science has this cool category called Keywords Plus, where they will lump our publications that are similar together under different keywords, even if an author did not use them. For translational science, we modeled our search terminology. Actually, we took it directly from a publication in 2017, and you can see our search terms here. Again, with Web of Science, when you see a little asterisk at the end, that means that any ending would work. So it would search both translational science and translational sciences. Just some Web of Science search terminology. But then we adapted from a different publication in 2020 for implementation science, being more strategic about which terms we used. The ones that I think were most do we include them, do we not, were knowledge mobilization, and knowledge translation, but after discussion, decided to include those. We also had near 5 proximity operators, which means that if we were searching translational research, for instance, if translation had 3 words in before it, like translation is awesome research, it would still show up because the terms translation and research were within 5 words of each other. At the end of our search, we had about 6,000 publications in translational science and 7,000 in implementation science. The next thing we did is we just pulled the top 50 cited papers anywhere in the literature where they were being cited, and we illustrated heat maps drawing upon previous procedures from Fort et al. So this here is our translational science network, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the top publications that are included in here. The darker colors indicate that there were more citations, and you can see them annually. We did our search through the end of 2022. The first article, Harris 2009, you can see came out in 2009, 12 citations in 2010, with those citations increasing greatly. That publication alone had a total of 23,000 plus citations. We see a much lower number as we go through, and we did this for 50, and I'm just showing you a screenshot here. These articles and references could be available upon request. So let's look at those top. Let's look a little bit at what this heat map is telling us. So of these top 50 publications, they were cited over 50,000 times. Median value seemed to make the most sense, that there were 356 citations per publication with a minimum of 247, and you saw that max over 23,000. So these are all 50 of these are very well cited publications. The top ones, you saw Harris et al., 2009. Some of you may know just from all of your work citing that this is actually the seminal article that discusses the research electronic data capture, or REDCap. And the second article is talking about building a consortium of practice related to that. So those are the 2 top publications cited in translational science. The third one is an article that's talking about how there's poor correlation in genomic responses between mouse models and human inflammatory diseases. We found that there were 5 additional publications that were cited more than 1,000 times. So a lot of articles being cited very well in this heat map. When we pull up the map for implementation science, we note that the top article, you might recognize it, is the seminal article about CIFER from 2009, had a total citation of 5,799 through 2022. And, so this is much lower than the REDCap article itself. But you'll also note that if you look at this, you just see more red and you see more consistent dark colors in the top. So we see, that there are actually, I think, 8 articles cited more than 1,000 times in this top area. Some other things that stand out between these 50 publications, they were cited 41,000 times. All right, so we actually have many more citations among these publications, especially when we consider that in the Translational Science Network, one publication was like half of that. Here the median's a little bit higher at 474 citations per paper. What were the top ones here? I talked about the top article is the CIFER model, or the development of the consolidated framework for implementation research, very common in the field. The second one reviewed purposeful sampling strategies and talked about mixed methods research and implementation science. And the third was sort of a seminal paper saying, what are outcomes that we can look at specifically related to implementation science that go beyond the service system or clinical treatment. So after we went ahead and just kind of got an idea of what are these top publications that are being cited from our systematic search, we then went forward and downloaded the references from Web of Science into an RIS format. I'm showing this step just because I think that, network mapping is kind of cool. And if anyone is ever curious of doing it or applying it to another area, happy to talk about how it works. We then uploaded these references into the free program called VOSviewer. There are pros and cons of all free programs, but one of the really great advantages is that this program can take in a lot of references at once, and it will create maps that show a link between publications that cite each other. So that's a little bit of a mouthful. So if I was to give an example, say I publish an article and I cite Jane Mahoney. Then when the network map comes up, there'll be a node or a circle with my name, and there'll be a line that's drawn to Jane Mahoney. Now, obviously, you can't cite articles that haven't existed yet. So all links are directed. We're going to talk about directed citation networks because the arrow has to go from one node to another. Because we have so many links that we're going to show you and the specific program that we use, you don't see the arrow, but you could always look at one publication and the other, and you'd be able to notice which year came first and therefore who cited who. So we created 3 maps. We're going to look at the first one together here. This is the translational science directed citation network. And just some things to note here. The bigger the node, the more links that come to and from that node. So if you look at it, you might see this one up here on the top, SEOK from 2013. It's bigger. That means there are more links leading in and out of it to others. What do the colors mean? The colors are an automatic cluster created by the network program that uses a mathematical logarithm to determine citations that or references that are similar to each other based on who's citing each other. So it's kind of like little hangout clubs. Sometimes it has meaning, sometimes it has less meaning. You have to interpret what that means. And when you see the gray color, it means that it's either not linked in any cluster itself, or maybe it's just in like a cluster of 1 or 2. So there's our translational science network. Let's talk a little bit about what this means. So of the 6,000 sort of publications that we mentioned in our systematic search, the first thing that's important to note is that only about 2,400, actually less, were included in the network. So that means only about a third of all of the publications are actually citing each other in translational science. We saw about 4,000 links, or those shared citations between publications. So I mentioned one of our aims was to look at intercited publications. So this means if, for the first example, where there's 118 links, that this article cited others and was cited the most compared to any other publications in the network. So Curry et al. Is from 2007 is that article, and this presented a 4-phrase framework to look at translational research specifically in genomics. Or in genomics, excuse me. This was followed by Ruby et al. In 2010 that considered the needs for workforce and training and how do we get people up and trained in translational research. And then again, that Harris article that we talked about before, which was sort of the seminal red cap article. Right. In contrast, this was our implementation science directed citation network. So just some things to note. You'll notice that it is just much more dense, right? Like one, there's just more publications and there's less open space between them. What this indicates is that there are generally just more citations between publications and between similar types of publications. As before, the larger the node size or the circle size and also the text size, the more links going to and from that publication. What are some things we note here? Of the 7,000 publications, 5,754 were included, so not all, but more than the other. And compared to translational science's network, which had about 4,000 to 5,000 links, here we have 25,000 links between the publications. The top intercited ones were our CFR article, with a whopping 1,277 links. The next was Graham et al., which defined kind of terminology. It's like, what does dissemination mean? What does translation mean? And provided a conceptual framework. And then Proctor et al., which we had mentioned again previously because it showed up in the heat map, which looks at implementation outcomes specifically. So we have those two individual networks. It's just sort of interesting to see how things are combined. That's kind of our curiosity question. But here, this was really the aim of our paper. So let's take all of those publications, the 6,000 from one search, the 7,000 from another, throw them all together, create a massive network, and see, are these publications overlapping? Do we think our authors are citing each other? So we looked at this a few ways, and I'm going to show you both visually and through some metrics. And I have a task that I'd like all of you to consider, because I will open it up and ask you to put your thought in the chat. And as a teacher, I know sometimes it's good to pose the question first, because then we pay a little bit more attention as we go forward. So the question I will have for all of you is, after I show this data, how would you interpret the overall overlap between these two fields? So you might say something like, I don't see any overlap. I see tons of overlap, anything in between. Okay, so I want you to keep this question in your back pocket as we look through these results. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. So here is our combined network. And it's a lot to take in at once, and I definitely understand that. But what I think helps break it down is this dark circle on the left is our implementation science network. Not exclusively, there are some publications that overlap, but if I were to rotate it 180 degrees to the right, it would look almost identical to what we saw. So you kind of see the more implementation research articles on the top. On the bottom, you see more things related to knowledge transfer. And then on the right, with the dotted line, these are primarily articles related to translational science. So again, you see lots of lines going between them. There are, publications that from one side that, went over to the other, but we still really see the general structure and integrity of the two existing frameworks when we combine them together. Overall, 8,247 publications were included, with 31,400 citation links among them. So this is the first thing I wanted to show, just the overall map. Let's assess the changes using some more mathematical methods. So we went back to our top 50 cited publications in both translational science and implementation science. And as a friendly reminder, this is cited anywhere in the literature, right? Like this could be cited by, by fields of medicine that have nothing to do and no, journal connection to implementation science. So for our top article, I'm going to talk you through, we calculated percent change increases in citation links. So the purple arrow jumps up and shows you this new column that has been added. So under TS links, that's links in translational science. So Harris from 2009 had 92 links to all of the other publications in translational science. So 92 out of 23,000 is definitely a small number, right? So there's a lot of people outside of the field who are working outside of the field of translational science citing this. Then, next column, in the combined network that I just showed you, when we added the implementation science links, we now see that there are 209. And using the basic percent change calculation, that was over 100% increase, 127. So this, I think, this top article is really a model article of collaboration between fields. In fact, we almost have like a similar number between them, even though it didn't come up or maybe was not as prominent within the implementation science network. So again, we have 50 of these articles. I'm just showing you a snapshot, data available upon request. But a few things I want to point out, if we go back to that first column, you'll notice that, I don't know, the 6th or 7th article actually has 0 links. So we had publications that came up in our literature search for translational science. And when we put them in a citation network, were not linked by any other publication in translational science. So that's sort of an interesting and I thought somewhat surprising finding. I want to, again, visually show that first article I talked about. So see, here we highlighted just the Harris article. And I think that we have 2 publications, only 2, in our whole network that I think are model collaboration articles, and this is one of them. So you can see it's sort of situated in the center of the map. That the centrality is important in network analysis because it means that, you know, it's not cited by just one part of the map, and that's why it ends up in the center. But if I reposition those circles for you, you can see implementation publications on the left in the solid line, translational science article publications on the right in the dotted line. And that Harris, all of those links coming from it really do equally go between those two networks. So this is the visual depiction of that 127% change. Some other things of interest, 21 of the 50 publications in our heat map did not have any citation links. So I mentioned that I showed you that one example that had 0. Well, 42% of those publications were not cited anywhere in the Translational Science Network. 7 of them, however, had over 100% increase in citation links. And the remaining 22 publications had an average 2.4% increase in citation links. So that means that, you know, maybe they were cited 10 times in translational science, and then when we added the implementation science articles, maybe now they're cited 11 times. But you see that the mode and the median are 0. So most of the time we don't have any increase. And the max after those 100% increases was only 16%. Then we did the exact same thing with our implementation science network. Some things to note when we look at the columns. This column now shows the number of links for the publication as it showed up in the implementation science directed citation network. And again, in the second column, when we combine with translational science and the percent increase, you can look at these top cited articles, which are also all red in our heat map. So this means they're all very well cited in implementation science, and see that there is hardly any percent increase of these top publications within translational science. So conversely, where we saw publications in implementation science citing translational work, we don't really see that same trend, at least in the top 10 publications here. So the top, the CFR article that we mentioned, I can contrast that previous diagram that I showed with Harris. Well, Harris was in the center and showed links across fields. This one is only on the left, and you can see that the majority of links fall within that solid implementation science field. Not saying that there aren't any over into translational science, but we can count them on one hand. Other things of interest with this. Compared to translational science, where about 42% of publications were not included, here there were only 2 that were not a part of the network map. There was only 1 publication with a 100% increase in citation links. But, you know, I don't know how much I want to jump up and down because it went from 4 to 10. So, but, you know, I'm sharing it. The remaining 47 publications saw an average increase of 3.3% in citation links. Mode here again was 0, median 1.2, and the max was 26%. Again, if you're ever curious to know which of those articles fall in, I'm always happy to follow up. I mentioned there was one other really critical bridging article besides Harris, and this is the Morris article. The title of this paper is "The Answer is 17 Years. What is the Question? Understanding Time Lags in Translational Research." And I think even just looking at the title, we can see that, you know, that 17-year number is quoted all the time in implementation science, but clearly in the title, it's talking about translational research. And I don't think I included the lines here. No, I didn't. But you can see that we have lots of overlap across the 2 sort of fields within our citation network. So having looked at that, one, I'm happy to take any questions because I don't know, you may not be jumping up and down to be a bibliometric scientist after that. But, you know, what do you think? How would you interpret this overlap? Having looked at some of those pictures, figures, and diagram between the literature in translational science and implementation science. And I'd love to see what you put in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute and share any thoughts. Is that okay if we take a second to do that? And, yeah, let's do it. And I'll give you a second to put in the chat as well. And then I'll figure out how to view the chat. There we go. Fabulous. It looks like I can only send things out to hosts and panelists. I don't know if the chat is limited to.
That should be a tab that you can switch.
All right, all right. Let's see. Well, I'm okay sending things to hosts and panelists.
I also have just to hosts and panelists, not to, and I can't.
Oh, I see everyone. Okay.
Everyone, there we go.
So I can now put in the question directly. And I see that someone has a hand raised. I'm not sure if they can be unmuted. Can I unmute them? I also welcome any thoughts from panelists too. So I see one comment about not much overlap based on findings.
Any of the participants can talk at this point.
Oh, thank you so much. The tech is always fun. We're getting better at it.
Do others have thoughts? And are you able to talk, unmute and talk?
So I see a comment too that initial interpretation would be that implementation science builds on translational science, but not the reverse. This is, I think, a really important thought, especially when we consider that beginning figure about how, implementation science as a determined field has just emerged later. So I think that logically that makes sense because you can only cite publications that have come before, but not the reverse. Yes, we were seeing that in some of our work. One of the limitations, I guess I'll just talk about it now, that people have in not just with this study, but all bibliometric research is like you can't cite backwards and there are citation lags. But I didn't see that as much of a limitation in this study because we had top cited publications as late as like 2018, 2019. I think we even have some from 2020. And our search went through 2022. So if an article was cited enough, even if it was recent, we were capturing it in our heat maps in our citation network. The next comment I see is that this is really interesting to see. Well, that's fabulous. It's great that people think that. I think that implementation science is citing within implementation science, but there's a bit more overlap with translational science and implementation science. Yeah, wonderful. And everyone should be able to unmute if they like. Fabulous. Well, I appreciate your thoughts because I actually, I looked at these results and I went, huh. We had done our analysis differently in our first revise and resubmit, where we had limited the publications that we included with implementation science and translational science. So I could actually show you a list of them without it being thousands of thousands. And when we did that, it was really easy because there was only like one link between the networks. So it was like not a lot of overlap. But here, I mean, there's definitely people citing each other. There are some publications that have well over 100% change increase. So, I don't want to say that there's zero happening. So in our paper, and I'm I feel free to welcome other ways to do this because I'm sure we'll get another revision. I shouldn't be sure, gut feeling. So I interpreted it to say that there's modest overlap, right? So, the most highly cited publications, we see a very small percent increase in citation links, no greater than 4% for some of these prominent publications across fields. We did see only 2 articles that had really model collaboration. I showed you the RedCap article and the Morris article that I think, that's if you're looking for like the gold standard of what a shared cited article would look like, this would be the case. But there were not a lot of them. but there still were, two, and there were some of a lesser extent that we didn't highlight. And then another conclusion that maybe was not an aim of our study, but is just interesting to note, is that implementation science publications, based in our analysis, are just more interconnected in the literature. And I based that on two metrics that, 82% of those publications were citing each other in our search, compared to 38% of translational articles. And that further, there were just so many more citations, even among those articles. Again, I don't know if that's completely surprising, because we were asked in our resubmission, and I see the reasons to do it, to include the terms translational research and translational and implementation research. But there's a difference between research and science, right? So, the research is actually within a specific field. So it's like I might be doing research in a lab on a very specific cell. And, I'm not sure even other folks in translational research who are, if they're not working in that directly, are they really going to be citing that? Why is implementation science going to be citing that? So probably not a huge surprise, but something that we really saw. I mentioned a few of these limitations. So the VOS Viewer program will only allow you to pull in references from Web of Science, but we had that limitation across both fields that we looked at, so at least it was standardized. Anytime you do a systematic search, you have to decide what articles to include, where to search, what terms. So, obviously, we did probably miss some publications, especially if an author didn't tag it as implementation science, or that wasn't in the title itself. And I mentioned the science versus research and the network lags. So what are some implications from this work? And I'm doing well on time. I think the first one for me was, what do we even want successful integration to look like from these fields? Again, I don't think we expect to see 100%, people citing each other across fields. It's not always going to be applicable for each article. And I know this is bibliographic, and it just has to do with references. There's all kinds of questions about why certain things are cited and others are not. But even in the fields themselves, what does successful integration and collaboration look like between those who work in translational science and implementation science? And then also some of the findings we think can reinforce and expand recommendations by others, specifically on things like advancing the mission of the CTSA program using implementation science. And I would argue too that it goes both ways, with a lot of things that implementation science can learn from translational science as well. So, we were able to highlight in our citation networks and in our heat maps some articles that might have really great methods, frameworks, and study designs that can be used across fields that maybe haven't been, that there's an opportunity to, use these findings to do interdisciplinary collaboration and inform training results. I think I mentioned one or two publications that are like, this just has great terminology and the difference between what all of these things are. Like, that would be great to include in when we're doing mentoring or new training of colleagues in this field. And what we hope overall is that, if we're increasing collaboration through the shared literature, it's actually a reflection of reducing redundancies within the fields themselves and saying, like, let's learn from each other, let's decrease isolation, let's ironically improve knowledge translation within the fields of knowledge translation, so that, we can bridge health research and practice more quickly and efficiently. And that's our talk for today. So I definitely welcome any questions, comments, and I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to share this work.
Thank you, Rose. This was great to hear and a lot to think about. I am going to start out with sort of one question, and then there are a couple questions that we have from attendees. One thing I noted is one of the top 5 of translational research was Belg, and it showed actually a lot of a pretty high increase when you combine it with the implementation science. I think it was like a 200, I can't remember. And it's interesting because it's from 2004, before the terminology for implementation science was even developed and widely used. So it may have been tagged as translational science or translational research, partly because of the terminology not being in common use. But the article I cited a lot and recommended a lot. It's on enhancing treatment fidelity in health behavior change studies, best practices and recommendations from the NIH Behavior Change Consortium. And now, if that were written now, that may very well get a keyword term of implementation science. And so I guess I have two questions for you related to that. Do you see implementation science as a subset or a science within the whole area of translational science? And then the second question is, do you think now as we write articles, should we use translational science and implementation science as keywords? I think a lot of implementation science scientists now just use the term, would put implementation science as a keyword and not put include it as translational science. So wonder about your thoughts about that.
Well, those are some fun questions in the field itself. So first of all, I think pretty prominent scholars who know a lot more about this field than I do have consistently situated that implementation science falls within a translational science spectrum or framework, whatever framework it is. And I think that makes sense. And I don't know if I argue strongly that it should be different. So I think from a conceptual framework standpoint, it's a subset. I see implementation science as a subset. But from a reality and practice standpoint, I don't think it operates as a subset. I mean, the people are different, the goals are different, what they're doing is different. I'm doing implementation science. I am not coming up with novel research and new medications. And, every now and then I might be involved in developing an evidence-based practice or program, but that's still not the majority of where my time lies. And, most of the people who are doing that, especially in the communities that need it the most, are not the ones who have the ability to disseminate it on a wide scale. So my answer is conceptually, yes, they're integrated, but I think practically, and what we're seeing maybe in a reflection of this study in the literature itself, is that the people and the players are different because a lot of their goals are different. And as much as we want to collaborate, who wants to sit in another meeting when they're trying to figure out what they have in common in the first place? Your second question was about, should implementation scientists be using translational science in their keywords? So my first thought is not connected. And I will just say what I don't recommend is don't just put implementation and don't just put translation if you want it to be a part of the field itself. Because when we looked at implementation, we're talking hundreds of thousands of articles that may not really have anything to do with implementation science, but are a lay term in how folks are using it. So that's a limitation of our search. It's well, do we want to include all of these things that are not super relevant, but we don't want to miss them? So we did it systematically across the two fields. I think it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a set answer. I think that including the term translational science would probably help those who do translational science to find those publications more efficiently. So I think it would depend on the actual type of implementation research. So it'd be I publish a study in implementation research. Oh, wouldn't that be great? Someone accepts another study. Fabulous. And I'm looking at it and I go back to that, framework, and I think, would they use guiding principles for my study based on that framework? If I think that my study talks about guiding principles, then maybe, yeah, I should cite translational science. If I look at it and I say, this is really about a very concrete, like, we need to get this in this community. We need it to be well received. It's all about feasibility. It's all about barriers or facilitators or whatever. I don't really know how that would help someone doing preclinical or the next step of basic research, sorry, the previous step, then maybe not. So again, I'm not given a great yes or no answer here, other than to say, I think it's a really great consideration to at least think about and see if that would be a good fit. And it might really help scholars find each other.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Anne if you'd like to unmute and ask your question about looking at overlaps. Are you able to unmute?
I'm sorry, Jane, that's somebody using my account.
Oh,
So I'm
okay.
not sure who that is, but whoever put that in there, if you would like to, yes, right, that might be Abram. I'm not certain.
Did you look at, well, I can just read it. Did you look at overlaps in the entire networks or just the
Oh,
top?
that was my question. Hi, Jane. This is Edmund Ramley.
Ah, great,
Uh,
Edmund. No.
yeah, so not sure what happened here. I used the link sent to me by email, so looks like there was an issue with the registration links. So I'm not Anne, I am Edmund. So yeah, my question was to Rose. This is really great work, and I look forward to reading the paper. The overlap that you were looking at between the citation networks, was that based just on the top 5 that you showed us in the tables, or did you also look at overlaps across all citations in both networks?
So we looked at overlaps for the top 50 most cited publications.
Right.
As a starting place. And there's no great way, like, you can't like just download an Excel file from the program. So you actually have to manually go in and count for each publication how many links there were before and after. So yeah, we chose 50 as sort of like a, these are very cited publications overall. How are they changing from one to another? So it wasn't 5, but it wasn't the whole network. However, the
Right. Yeah.
network
Sorry,
maps.
I misspoke. I meant 50. But yeah. So it's interesting. So that is a limitation of the program you used, in that you weren't really looking at all interconnections. You were looking at interconnections in the most highly cited, because it's very possible that some of the articles that were cited 5 times or 10 times or 20 times were citing each other across the networks, and you would not have been able to capture that, correct?
Yeah, one thing I will say though is, I mean, we have the list of the thousands of publications. A lot of them are not cited a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that it's not like all of these things are cited 500 times each. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there could be more overlap. I think that's why the visual depictions of the maps
Mm-hmm.
maybe give a better picture of the whole overall of what's happening. That if we had seen what looked like, scrambled eggs when we put those images, put those links together, we'd be like, everyone's citing each other, but we still were
Right,
able to
right.
see the structures.
Very interesting.
Good question and good thing to point out too.
So there's a question from Rachel. Would you like to ask your question, Rachel? If you want to unmute. Well, it's how do these findings apply to implementation and/or translation in actual context?
That's a great question. I just want to own the fact this is a little bit of a theoretical project. Like, we are looking to see what overlap is, and we're looking for a way to visualize it and quantify it. But from a practical standpoint, in the paper itself, and I was limited here. I'm like, I only have 40 minutes. So I actually cut some of the ending slides, but we actually highlight publications that would be helpful for you. So it's like if you are, doing X, Y, and Z, or you're working in policy, whether you're working in policy change related to translational science or implementation science, probably the latter, but could be the former. Here are some top cited publications that we think would be great in that arena, or ones related to mental health. Or things that are focused on health equity. So we have some more practical guidelines of, obviously I couldn't show you the titles of, well over 100 publications, and we only got to look at a few in this presentation. So I hope that the actual findings of the research and how people could use them will be more of the actual context implication.
Great, thanks. And Rose? There's another question from Beverly. Beverly, are you able to ask it, or I can?
Hi, yes, good afternoon. I'm just wondering, a lot of conversation about what box falls in what, and to me, it seems like these are really just tools. And I'm wondering if they don't need to necessarily fit in a box, because really the goal is, in both worlds, is for whatever exists to be effective and impactful. So just kind of a shift in the lanes that we're putting things in, and really thinking about if the tools can be, if I happen to have a translational project, doesn't mean it couldn't also have an implementation component, which might be necessary in order to have the impact that I'm trying to have. And I think maybe that's kind of the historic problem, is we kind of have this kind of industrialized look at lanes, and then people staying in their lanes. And I wonder if we were individually more multidisciplinary, if our work would have greater impact on society.
I mean, I think you raise a really, really good point that, once we start adding the labels and the lanes, like, are we already segregating ourselves into different areas and groups of people? I do believe that the overall aim is the important one, which is like, we don't want people working in isolation, repeating the wheel, and not learning from each other. And that there are brilliant scientists working, in whatever field or whatever lane we want to define it as, and we just want to make sure that those things are being disseminated as well as possible to everyone. And which is sort of an ironic meta comment of like, how do knowledge transfer fields do knowledge transfer within the fields that maybe they should have or should never have created in the first place. So I really appreciate you bringing up that perspective, and I think it's a very important one.
I think the one article that really maybe exemplifies this is the Lapine article you mentioned, where it's trying to look at what can be the possible utility for dissemination and implementation sciences across the spectrum of research, that knowing or having some basic understanding can help you, whether you're in the basic or the preclinical or clinical. And it will be interesting to look to see how much that blends over, or if that potentially leads to some impact. But it's sort of such a new way of conceptualizing that it's going to take a lot of conversation to figure out, well, how can it be helpful in the early stages of translational research? So come back, do this again in another 10 years, and we'll see what this looks like then.
I mean, that would actually be kind of fun to repeat at that time. Well, I'm welcome to be contacted. I'll put my email in the chat one more time, and I really appreciate all of you. I know you're busy people coming in to talk about this and having the opportunity to share some of the work we've done today.
So thank you so much, Rose. This was really great, and thank you everyone for attending. And we do have, thank you, Rose, for putting your email in there, and look forward to seeing it in publication. All right, have a great rest of your day.
Real quickly, we'll send a follow-up survey for you all to provide your feedback on today's talk. And so if you could fill that out, please do. Your input is really valuable to us. And thank you, Rose, for an excellent talk.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it and have a wonderful weekend.
All right, bye.